Two ships faced one another, one laden with innocent passengers and the other laden with much-needed barley and oats. As the carrier neared the passenger liner, everyone on the bridges of both ships began to sweat. It was a game of chicken that didn't need to be played, as one had the right of way. Who would turn first, and would it make a difference? Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Thank you to our viewer Nathan Preston for suggesting this video to us long ago. We are going to take a deep dive into this ship today, starting with her time in Germany. She started out as a ship built for Norddeutscher Lloyd named SS Berlin, and she was built by Bremer Vulcan AG in Wegessack, Germany as yard number 614. She was launched on March 24th or the 25th of 1925, sources differ. She was commissioned on September 17, 1925. Her home port was located in Bremen in the Weimar Republic, and her route ran from Bremen to Southampton to Cherbourg to New York City. Before we get much further into her story, let's look at her specs. She was a passenger liner that would go through a major conversion after World War II, but prior to, her tonnage sat at 15,286 gross register tons and 17,053 gross register tons after this conversion. She was 572 feet long and had a beam of 69 feet wide, and had a capacity for 1,101 passengers plus an overflow of 24 extra passengers, breaking down into 323 first class, 290 second class, and 488 third class. As for crew, she had 313 plus 41 extra. We don't know a ton about her propulsion system, but we know she averaged speeds of 16 knots. Her IMO number for her lifespan is 5002986, though her call sign would change throughout her life cycle. At first, she was known as QMBT, then it would shift to DOCL during World War II. After World War II, when she went to the Soviet Union, it changed to UKDD. As Berlin, she had a black hull, red keel, and white superstructure with 2 orange funnels. As Admiral Nakhimov, her hull and superstructure were crisp white, her keel was forest green, and her funnels were white with a red stripe near the top, and a red star on each side of the tip of the bow. At any point in her life, she was unmistakably beautiful, though this beauty would not save her from disaster. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Alright, let's get into her career and World War II. SS Berlin started her route on September 26, 1924, and she'd operate with no incidents until May of 1939, when she was laid up in Bremerhaven for refitting. She didn't have any incidents in this time period, but on November 12, 1928, she rescued the passengers and crew of the liner Vestris, which sank off the coast of Virginia en route from New York City to Barbados. 108 people died in that sinking, unfortunately. If you would like to hear more about Vestris, just let me know in the comments. Starting in 1939, Berlin would be chartered by the Strength Through Joy or Kraft durch Freude (KDF) program of the Nazi Party for use as a workers' vacation ship, and would later be used as a hospital ship just before World War II started. Berlin was one of 8 German ships commissioned as hospital ships, or Lazarettschiff, during World War II. Most, if not all, of these ships also served in other capacities during the war after being decommissioned as hospital ships, mainly as accommodation or transport ships for military personnel. All German hospital ships were given alphabetic identifiers, and Berlin's was A. On July 16, 1939, Berlin began her conversion to a hospital ship and entered service with the Kriegsmarine as Lazarettschiff A, Sanitätsamts Ost, on August 23, 1939. As a hospital ship, she had berths for 400 patients, with a crew of 165. Initially, she served in Norwegian waters, being identified as, quote, Field Post Number 07520. By January of 1945, Berlin was assigned to Operation Hannibal, which was the transport of refugees and soldiers from the eastern Baltic. Other ships involved in this venture were the Goya and the infamous Wilhelm Gustloff, which is the worst maritime disaster in history. On January 31, 1945, while forming up in convoy to head east, Berlin struck a sea mine off Świnoujścia, western Pomerania, and was put in tow for Kiel. She then hit another mine and was beached at 11:53 p.m. at 54 degrees 3 minutes north, 14 degrees 19 minutes east in shallow waters. There was only one fatality, thank goodness. All usable equipment was salvaged from the ship by February 5, 1945, and the ship was then abandoned. This was her last hurrah as a German ship, and she'd then become payment. After World War I and World War II, Germany was made to pay war reparations. This was an enormous sum of money, as well as ships, machinery, and manufacturing plants. All of this together totaled about $23 billion, and this was in 1945's dollars. Finland, Italy, Hungary, and Romania were also required to pay reparations. The main recipients of German reparations were the US, UK, and France. However, the Soviet Union also got their own cut. By 1960, Germany had paid out $5.2 billion, which amounted to 3% of 1960 German output. This doesn't sound like a lot, but it was. Germany was paying reparations and compensation to Holocaust victims and their heirs from 1945 all the way up till 2018, and this totaled to about $86.8 billion. Germany didn't finish paying for World War I until October 3, 2010, paying the US their final installment of $94 million. In 2022, the nation of Poland demanded $1.3 trillion in reparations for damage incurred by occupying Nazi Germans during World War II. Poland renewed this demand in 2024, but Germany has denied reparations both times, saying that this matter was settled long ago when they paid approximately $8 million in 1992 to the Polish government as reparations. I can see both sides of the argument. The Germans that would be paying for this now, at least 99% of them, were not alive during that time, nor did they commit these crimes. However, acknowledging the mistakes of the past and paying for them would help to ensure that this never happens again. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think justice has been served, or do you think Poland's demands are justified? Anyways, with reparations, the Soviet Union would receive SS Berlin. In 1946, work began on its lifting by the Emergency Rescue Service of the Baltic Fleet. In a short time, all compartments were sealed underwater and pumping of water began. However, the liner was mined by the Germans, and when during the ascent on New Year's Eve 1947, its bow appeared above the surface of the water, a strong explosion occurred. This was unfortunately common, as Germans were angry to have to pay reparations for World War II and finished paying on World War I's reparations as well. Because of this, the ship sank for the second time, pressing down the diver Timothy Starchenko, who went down under its bottom to plug a leak in one of the aft compartments. He was pressed into the mud, but he was saved by a hard copper helmet. Thanks to the quickly performed unique rescue effort, the diver managed to pull out alive through a tunnel specially made under the bottom of the ship. A second attempt to save her was made, and this time, the ship was lifted and sent for major repairs. After repairs and refits, she was named SS Admiral Nakhimov after Admiral Pavel Nakhimov, a 19th century Russian naval commander who played a prominent role in the Crimean War. This conversion was the one that increased her gross registered tonnage to 17,053. She entered passenger service for the Black Sea Steamship Company in 1957, officially a Soviet Union ship. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, she was used to transport troops to Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended up being the world's most tense game of chicken, and eventually, President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev were able to reach a civil agreement, avoiding nuclear war. During the peak summer travel season, Admiral Nakhimov operated cruises on the Black Sea between Odessa and Batumi, a 6-day round trip. She carried an average of 1,000 people per voyage, and she was the flagship of the Black Sea passenger fleet for several years until more modern liners entered service. She operated this route for years without major incident, up until 1986. And in 1986, everything would take a turn for the worse. Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Alright, let's look at her sinking and the following investigation. At 10 p.m. Moscow time on August 31st, 1986, Admiral Nakhimov set out from Novorossiysk en route for Sochi, its next stop. Aboard were 888 passengers and 346 crew members. Most of the passengers were Ukrainian, with the remainder from Russia, Moldova, and other parts of the then Soviet Union. The captain of the ship that night was Vadim Markov. The ship was just minutes into the voyage and hadn't even left the harbor when the ship's pilot noticed that the large bulk carrier, Pyotr Vasev, was on a collision course with the ship. Pyotr Vasev was a Japanese-built 18,604-ton freighter recently acquired by the Soviet Union, and was carrying a cargo of barley and oats from Baie-Comeau, Canada. The pilot radioed a warning to Pyotr Vasev, and the freighter responded nonchalantly, quote, "Don't worry, we will pass clear of each other. We will take care of everything." Despite this reassurance, Captain Viktorchenko of Pyotr Vasev did nothing to change course or slow his ship. Convinced that the freighter would just pass without incident, Captain Markov retired to his cabin. This left his second mate Alexander Chodnovsky in charge. From 11 p.m., Chodnovsky radioed Pyotr Vasev several times, asking her about her course and further actions. Chodnovsky changed the ship's course 10 degrees portside. At 11:10 p.m., Chodnovsky cried on VHF to the freighter, quote, "Immediately reverse full astern." When it was clear the freighter was headed directly for the ship, Pyotr Vasev's engines were thrown in reverse. Admiral Nakhimov turned hard to port, but it was too late. Just 2 agonizing minutes later, at 11:12 p.m., Admiral Nakhimov was struck by Pyotr Vasev 8 nautical miles from the port at Novorossiysk and 2 nautical miles from shore, at 44 degrees 36 minutes 15 seconds north, 37 degrees 52 minutes 35 seconds east. While many passengers had gone to bed, some were on deck listening and dancing to music. They could only watch helplessly as the freighter struck the starboard side dead on at a speed of about 5 knots. Admiral Nakhimov continued forward with the freight's bow lodged in her side, dragging and ripping a 900-square-foot hole in her hull between the engine and boiler rooms. Just for context, the 6 thin openings the iceberg left in the side of Titanic totaled to only about 12 to 13 square feet. So this hole in the side of Admiral Nakhimov was absolutely devastating. Due to the massive hole and all 90 windows being open, she immediately began listing to starboard, and her lights went out upon impact. After a few seconds, the emergency diesel generator powered on, but the lights went out again just 2 minutes later, plunging the ship into total darkness. People below decks found themselves lost in the dark and rapidly canting the hallways. Without power, the system of remote closing the watertight bulkhead's doors did not work, although due to the flooding of 2 compartments, a ship with the current design would still not be able to stay afloat. This ship was sinking, and sinking fast. This meant there would be no time to launch the lifeboats. This is because the rapidly formed list was so severe that lifeboats could not be launched as it quickly exceeded the designed allowable 20 degrees. In addition, according to some witnesses, the lifeboats and davits were painted on the spot, and the older davits were destroyed by corrosion, which made launching at least some of them completely impossible regardless of the list. From the forecastle on the port side, it was possible to lower just 1 lifeboat, but by that time there was no longer the power needed for the winches to lower it into the water. Only later, when the ship was sinking, was this lifeboat able to sail. As a result, life rafts had to be thrown from the ship into the water, and they managed to launch 32 out of the 48 life rafts. Hundreds of people were forced to dive into the oily sea, clinging to life jackets, barrels, and pieces of debris as the ship sank out from under them. Just 7 minutes after the collision, Admiral Nakhimov rolled onto her beam ends and sank stern first. Rescue ships began arriving 10 minutes later. Pyotr Vasev was not badly damaged, only having a crunched bow, and assisted in the rescue effort. 64 rescue ships and 20 helicopters swarmed the scene like ants on a cupcake, and 836 people were pulled from the water out of the 1,234 on board. Some people were so slippery with fuel that they could not keep hold of the hands of the rescuers. Sailors had to jump into the water to save people. Admiral Nakhimov's ventilation was poor, so that is why all of the windows were open during the collision. The several bulkheads that would have prevented the ship from sinking were removed during the conversion. This meant she could only stay afloat with 1 compartment flooded, while most ships could remain afloat with at least 2 flooded compartments. The wreck of Admiral Nakhimov lies on its starboard side in 150 feet of water in Sems Bay off Novorossiysk. Pyotr Vasev was renamed and operated under their other flags until 2012. As for the victims, the crew and passengers had little time to escape, and 423 of the 1,234 on board would perish. 64 of those killed were crew members, and 359 were passengers. The event wouldn't be reported until 48 hours later, and the survivors were only allowed to send telegrams stating, quote, "Alive and well in Novorossiysk. Rest in peace to the victims of this horrific sinking, and may the survivors and family and friends of the victims find peace and justice in the aftermath." Speaking of the aftermath, let's get into that. To help the divers of the Black Sea Shipping Company, a large specialized rescue vessel, SS-21, arrived at the scene of the Admiral Nakhimov tragedy after 10 hours, which, after a months-long campaign, had just returned to Sevastopol from the Mediterranean Sea. The reconnaissance divers of the 17th Special Forces Brigade of the Black Sea Fleet were also urgently involved in the rescue work. Military divers immediately joined the work on the inspection of the sunken liner. It was extremely difficult to search underwater on an overturned vessel. For greater safety, the divers inside the ship worked in pairs and on the upper decks used balloon-breathing apparatuses with an autonomous supply of oxygen-nitrogen mixture. The oak doors of the Nakhimov's interiors were swollen with water, and as a result of this, they often had to be undermined with explosive charges. One diver died due to lack of air, and he passed on September 10, 1986, being Midshipman Yuri Vladimirovich Polishchuk, commander of a platoon of reconnaissance divers of the Black Sea Fleet Special Forces Brigade. Rest in peace to him. After this incident, it became much more common to use diving equipment with a traditional supply of a breathing mixture through a hose from the ship providing descent. On September 19, 1986, a brave midshipman named Sergei Alexander Shardakov was headed to the 41st cabin, in which, according to eyewitnesses, had children's remains locked inside. He tried with all his might to open the door with a crowbar, getting tangled in his own cables and hoses, cutting off his air supply, and he lost consciousness. His partner managed to pull him out of the corridor, but he died before the arrival of help from the surface. Rest in peace to him as well. After his death, as well as due to the completion of the survey of most of the premises, the production of underwater work on the sunken liner was halted by the decision of the Government Commission, prior to all cabins being entered. This must have been a difficult decision to make, and not necessarily one any of us agree with, but can understand why it was made. As for the inquiry, the Soviet government formed a commission of inquiry to investigate the disaster. It determined that both Captain Markov of Admiral Nakhimov and Captain Chechenko of Pyotr Vasev had violated navigational safety rules. Despite repeated order to let Admiral Nakhimov pass, Chechenko refused to slow his ship and only reported the accident 40 minutes after it had occurred. Captain Markov was absent from the bridge. The inquiry took place in 1987 in Odessa. In March of 1987, the captains of both ships were found equally guilty of shipwreck, loss of life, and sentenced to 15 years in prison each. Both captains were released early in the fall of 1992. After his release, Captain Markov worked as a captain mentor in the Black Sea Shipping Company and lived in the city of Odessa, where he passed away in 2007. Captain Chechenko went abroad immediately after his release, and under circumstances that were not fully clarified, he died in September of 2003 when a yacht crashed near the coast of Canada. The loss of Admiral Nakhimov resulted in the deaths of 423 innocent people and was entirely preventable. This is why learning about maritime safety and learning from mistakes of the past is so vastly important. That way we can avenge those who were lost by saving future lives from disaster. Rest in peace to all of the victims of this horrific, needless tragedy, and may all of the survivors and victims' families and friends find peace and justice. I wish you nothing but the best. In one of only 2 battleship duels of the Pacific War, a Congo-class battlecruiser launched an attack on an American battleship, the blast from her guns lighting up the night sky. The American ship was damaged, but her ally beside her fired, and Kirishima was hit badly. In next week's episode of Shipwreck Sunday, we get into the story of the Japanese battlecruiser Kirishima.